There you go. Thank you. Sorry.
Awesome. Thank you, Toby. Yeah, we are now live. So thank you everyone again for your patience. And again, we are here, Compensation Advisory Committee, meeting to go over the results of the survey that our data took. And again, with us is Bob Butler from the Wisconsin Association of School Boards. And Bob's going to kick us off with a little bit of some demographic survey summary information before we then get into our next steps in breakout group work. So welcome and thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to look here to try to share the survey results. I know everybody has it, but I think it might be easier if I do that while I'm speaking. So can you see the survey?
Yes, we can.
We can, we're good.
All right, fantastic. All right, so, and hopefully everybody got a copy of it. If you didn't, Toby can probably send it out to you as well. And if you didn't get it, just put it in the chat and she'll try to get it to you. So basically, when we look through these first few questions, just that general overview on the demographics of the district. And first off, I want to commend you for having an outstanding response rate. Steve and I speculated that we probably had close to 90% of the staff to submit responses to this survey. And that's really helpful for informing, I think, the committee's work for one, but also two, it just about guarantees the validity of the answers here as far as how things would rank or how people's feelings are. So it's a very, very representative sample. So that kudos to you for a great job in filling this out. So the first one, or the first couple that we just kind of go through the real brief introduction as to people putting forth their demographic information about what area they taught. That's similar to what we see in other school districts. So a little bit more than half of the staff are in regular education teacher, and then with the majority being split among special ed, specials, elective teachers, and other professional educators. That's similar with the work levels. This is, again, quite similar to what we have in other school systems as well. You have a few more staff who are in multiple schools, and that sometimes becomes, an item that groups talk about with the additional planning time that job might involve and or travel that occurs. The next one felt was interesting as far as years of service. And as you saw from the data and the relative breakdown, the district is relatively split. And what I mean by that is you have people falling in all the respective categories, but close to half of the staff have been in the system for 9 years or less. And now there is a divergence between the overall years of service in the system compared to years of service that someone has in education. We'll get to that for a moment. But with this kind of breakdown, when you have close to 23 or almost 24%, so almost a quarter of the staff has only been in the system for 3 years or less, that may play into our conversations about starting salary and how people advance through the schedule. Next, as I alluded to, when we look at overall teaching experience, and Steve and I had a conversation in planning for this, this clearly shows that the district is not reluctant to hire staff who have outside experience, because you see that graphic where earlier it was 1 to 3 years of experience in the system. Well, overall, only 8.5% have 1 to 3 years of teaching experience. So clearly people are coming into the school system with some level of outside experience. And where that, again, may be relevant for the group is in addressing handbook language or compensation plan language that talks about how newly hired people get placed on the pay system, particularly when they have experience from another public school. So I thought that was an interesting divergence there. So clearly just not hiring people straight out of school and then matriculating through the grid. Then this piece also was interesting. I would say your district is on the high end of districts I've worked with a percentage of staff that have a master's degree. So what I mean by that is, typically we'll see at the high end, maybe 60%, 65% have a master's degree. you're far in excess of that. So clearly staff have been motivated to get that master's degree either when they've been within the system or they're coming in with it. So you have a very well-educated workforce in your school system. And I think that's when we get to some of the later questions, you'll see that reflected in the responses that people have to the relative ranking that they give the master's degree. Similarly, when we talk about the salary schedule placement, it's nearly identical to the prior numbers, but as we suspected, some employees who haven't moved yet to the master's degree are reflected in this little bit of divergence in the listing of their actual degrees attained versus where they are placed on the salary grid. So that's just a quick overview of the demographics. I just open up quickly for the group before we break people up into the respective categories. If there were any questions or things that you thought as a group that surprised you, or things that you thought you might want a little more information on when we look at the demographic answers there. Nothing is this, I assume this must be just what everybody expected then?
I'm just looking to, I see head nods as I'm looking around there at the room here, Bob.
Okay, well, I guess silence is affirmation. This is what people expected, Steve. So perhaps now we'll go into the next part of the work. And this, we're going to have to rely on Toby's expertise for a bit. But what Steve mentioned earlier in the email and when we first kicked off this evening is that you're going to be placed in various groups. And the groups are going to have a charge to review the answers that were put forth on those specific questions. Most of them have a similar theme. We tried to package them together. Once again, we'd ask you to have, someone who is the clerk, the note taker for the group, and someone who is the spokesperson when we come back out. Because of the breadth of the qualitative data in here, we were looking at having a roughly 30-minute time frame for you each to go through these respective questions and the responses that you saw, how you reflected upon those responses as a group, what you think they may foretell for what kind of modifications could be made, if any, to your existing compensation system, and share that within the group at large when we come out to have our group discussion. Steve, is there anything you'd like to add to that piece of it?
No, I think that covers it. I mean, we certainly want to remind people to, when you get into groups, there's going to be a roughly 6 people, give or take, in each breakout group, and that you do take the time to identify someone who will both take some notes for you so that we can capture those at the end of the evening, as well as somebody who's going to be willing to speak or at least kick off the summary from your group when we come out of the breakout. But as Bob mentioned, quite a bit of data here and very qualitative in nature. So as you look for themes, general ideas, that's what we're looking for. And just so everyone knows, the 3 groups will be group 1 that will do questions 7 and 8. So this is the strengths and weaknesses, very, very lengthy sort of responses from folks. Like, what is it that you get when you look at the 244 people who wanted to comment about strengths or weaknesses? So that's group 1. Group 2 will do 9, 10, and 11, which is really kind of this whole question about, well, what do you think is important and what do you value? And that, again, so that kind of to save everybody the time to have some conversation about, are there patterns? Are there things that you see that speak more loudly than others when it comes to the idea of things that people value or what's important? And then group 3 will be questions 12, 13, and 14. And as you get into that end piece, we start to talk about, what makes you stay. What would it be if there was something that you were not happy with? what would those things be? And each of these, we, as Bob indicated, we tried to break them up so that each group would have a similar amount of sort of breadth to be reading through when it comes to the qualitative data back. So other than that, again, Toby's going to try to equally divide us up here, and that should put 6, I think, folks, give or take, into each group. And we'll make sure that the time is there so that you can watch how much time you have as a group to be working as well. Any other?
Yeah, we'll shoot to. I'm sorry, Steve, go ahead.
No, just any other questions before we put you into those groups, or Bob, whatever your comment was going to be.
No, I was just thinking, yeah, let's shoot for a 6:15. That's roughly a half hour. And the one thing Steve didn't mention was the very last question we did not put into a breakout group, because I think we can approach that further on, either at the end of the meeting as a entire group discussion, or if need be, that can get discussed at a future meeting. But we really wanted to nail down these particular questions and what your analysis was on those first thing.
Are we ready then?
Yeah, Toby, why don't you work your magic then?
Okay. Invitations have been sent.
Steve, one of the comments I saw on the master's degree, so in the existing handbook or in the past, in order to get placed in the master's degree, it had to be in the field that they're teaching and or education? Or is it possible that I could have a master's degree in math, for example, and still be placed in the master's column? Do you know?
I believe it was the latter, that
Okay.
there was very little, if any, and I just have the handbook language in front of me. I don't think it was that there was any specificity to the notion of, somebody having to fit a certain area. If they had a master's degree, it qualified.
I'm gonna.
Hi, Deb, welcome.
Hi.
We are in breakout rooms, Deb. So if you give me a second, I'm gonna assign you to one. Steve, do you just kind of want to give her the overview of what the plan is?
Do you know where you're gonna put her, Toby?
I will probably put her in room 3.
So Deb, we just went over just the basic demographic information in the survey, and then broke out into rooms and have the survey chunked. And so room 3, where you'll be headed, is talking about numbers 12, 13, and 14.
Okay.
And we're going to do that till about 6:15. So about 25 more minutes, and then come back and spend some whole group discussion time with people who are then leading. Here's what we saw in terms of themes, etc.
Okay, great. I already looked it over, so.
Awesome.
And I had another meeting, so that's why.
No worries. Thank you so much, Deb.
Sure.
Steve, when some of the folks in this on the area they cite, and I'm looking in the weaknesses, they're talking about there's no district support for credits and or degrees. So we don't do any form of credit reimbursement, even on a case-by-case basis.
Correct. There used to be, and I'm not sure when that went away. That predates my time here for sure.
Okay. And then when people reference comparables in your base wage negotiations, have the groups ever come up with any sort of set agreement as to who they view to be comparable?
No, I know that Ruth or Connie and I oftentimes will use sort of 2 comp sets. One is our immediate area, but then one is what we would deem to be like schools. And
Okay.
part of the reason that we do that, or have been doing that, at least as of late, is because the immediate area has the West Scotia Central, the Wilmot, the Union Grove, the Waterford. These are all union high schools.
Right.
And then they have the K-8s that feed into them. And so one of the things that does, of course, is it makes our comps a little bit skewed and challenging, because those union high schools do function a little bit differently. However, we do have Elkhorn next to us, which we would consider to be certainly comparable as a K-12. On some level, Delavan. There are times we look at places like maybe Watertown, or even if we go further out to like Stoughton or north of Milwaukee.
Okay.
But
So
we
you
try
pick
to
approximate
stay away
in size then? Is that?
Yeah, because we try to stay away from the Metro Milwaukee market, the Muskego, the Oak Creek, the Franklin, Tosa. That ring around Milwaukee, much like the ring around Madison, the pay is just different, and we really, frankly, can't keep pace with what that first suburban ring pays.
Yeah. Do you have, I mean, I know we've talked before about you have phenomenal retention rates when individuals leave and and they stay in public education in state. Is there any pattern as to where they're going? Or is it just completely haphazard wherever the vacancy is?
We have not, I should say, I have not really been able to observe a pattern about where people are going. And in fact, oftentimes the one pattern that I have been able to kind of call out is, frankly, people who finish a degree in something specialized, counseling, administration, and the opportunity is just not here, or the opportunity is not here at the time that they're interested in executing a professional growth opportunity that we may not have. So that there is, I think, what I might even say is a little bit of a pattern there, because when people finish school and they feel ready, that's a thing. The other piece is that I think because of where we're located, we also are, we land as a place that is easily commutable for spouses until their spouse's job changes. And so what might look good originally, if they're driving to Lake Geneva or Kenosha or Racine or Milwaukee, or maybe even to Northern Illinois, at first that can look really, really good. But maybe if your family expands during that time, things get a little bit more hectic, then commuting, something has to maybe give. And so I think, occasionally we see something like that too, but those aren't like screaming loud patterns. They're just things that I know have occurred.
Okay. Yeah, and I think the one with, the degree, obviously, if the person gets their degree as, school psych, and you don't have an opening, well, that's going to be it. But you don't have, like we have in some areas where I'll have a district, for lack of a better term, that will be very aggressive or opportunistic in their hiring and says, oh, this is a high quality school. I'll go in and look at the DPI 1202 reports, and I need a high school AP English teacher. Boom. I'll offer him or her $5,000 more and take them. You don't really have that going on per se.
Not really.
That's good.
I do think that depending on who you ask, and as you really read into the survey, I think there are some environments where someone may think compensation, the grass is greener, whether it's insurance, post-retirement, whatever. There's some element to that, but I think that's really few and far between.
Okay. All right. So at some point if we get to that point of having more dialogue about how the system rates, we will probably have to have some conversation as to who should be in the labor market, who should be contemplated for that.
I think that there's some truth to how we balance those market factors, because that has been an issue, you know, whether it's tech ed, orchestra, special education, English language learners.
Uh-huh.
There's a whole host of examples, I think.
That's helpful.
And I don't know, you know, if that's a phenomenon that rings true across the state, you know, right now, because it is a little bit, people are a little bit more mobile than they have been historically.
Yeah, no, there's a considerable uptick in teacher turnover. And then I always try to break it down into the avoidables versus the unavoidables. So when you talk about the situation where the employee first came into the district and the commute was manageable, or the spouse lived, you know, work was closer by, and then the family makes the decision while the person got transferred to the Twin Cities or something, not a whole lot you're going to be able to do to keep that staff person, which is different than if you had a neighboring district or districts who were consistently hiring your staff away, particularly when the staff hits year, let's say 5 through 9. So they figure, well, the district's got a good job on professional development and orienting that new educator. And so we'll hire them then, and in essence, not have the same peer coaching, mentoring costs, but get the benefit of all that being borne by their former district.
I do think that we risk that a little bit, again, with our proximity to the more suburban ring around Milwaukee. Just from a straight salary, I know that our business managers have looked at kind of the comps straight up and down the line, and I think it's not huge. I don't know that the gap is huge. It's probably a few $1,000s depending on where you are in your career. But for some folks, that could be enough.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't get the sense that that's something that we are really like fighting against. It's there. I think there's a level of awareness, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe that it's really prevalent.
Well, that's good.
And certainly if that became a question, we'd have to dig into that a little bit more in terms
Right.
of really doing a data dive.
Well, I just remember from our first conversation that we had, just that the attrition rate was extremely low.
Very low. Yep.
So, I mean, that right away says that you don't have perhaps some of the same immediate labor market pressures. Doesn't mean that they may not appear, you know, in the future as the overall market tightens. I mean, one modest positive trends is we did have more applicants in 18-19 enter the School of Ed statewide in teacher certification programs than we did in the prior year. That's the first uptick in 10 years. Now, whether that is sustained in 1920 and beyond, you know, we'll see. That data comes from federal Title II reports that get sent out. So there's always a lag. But
Sure.
for 10 years, we had a reduction year over year. And the numbers are still they're 31% lower than they were in 2010. So obviously that puts pressure on the labor market when there's fewer people going and getting a degree. But that was, like I said, 18-19 was the first year where we had an upswing from the prior couple of years' averages. So we'll see if that goes forward.
It will, and I will be really curious in the sense that the pandemic is now in the middle of that kind of hopper, and
Right.
how that has potentially shifted people's views in any direction relative to working in education, or just what the appearance of availability is in the job market. Because certainly, you know, the talk, I think from lots of folks, is that the shortage of staff that's being kind of felt throughout the state, or, you know, nationally, is here to stay for a little while. So that is
Yeah.
encouraging if those 18.
Yeah, again, that was whether it was a 1-year oddity. I mean, because that's the people that takes the total aggregate of people enrolled. It doesn't have degree completers. Degree completers remain relatively flat.
Okay.
So and that would be expected that the degree completers would take a few years to catch up to that enrollment uptick. But like I said, it's hard to know whether that was a 1-year blip where it got higher or whether the pattern will continue. I mean, the updated data should be available relatively soon, but probably sometime over the summer.
Yeah, I'm trying to think maybe if that was a WASB report, if that was something that came out of your office relative to
It's
study.
I can call it up. I mean, it's like I said, I've done the presentations on it, but it's off of the reports that each school district in each state have to report to the federal government. Let me find it here.
Or maybe it was something John was talking about too. I don't remember. But I know there was a lot of talk a couple years ago about those enrollment numbers.
Let me just find this. Yeah, this is Title II reports, the highlights from the Department of Education. Yeah, they still most recent up to date is 18-19. So they go off of the updated reports don't get sent out until October of 2021.
And do you believe that they collected it last year?
They say they did,
Okay.
but it's off of the reporting year of 18-19. So I mean the number of degree completers was basically stagnant. And so in comparison to where it was in 2010. So in 2010, all the various programs of the state had 4,192 degree completers.
Okay.
The last time they have the data was 2,845. So, and it's been steadily declining, and then it kind of leveled out. So 2016 was the lowest, and then there was a very small bump up. When I say small, it's only 55 people the next year, and then the last year of reporting it was 15 higher. So there's it's pretty much plateaued at that level. So we'll see where the next data will come from. But as you talk about when people discuss, what the labor market is like, when you see that data on the inputs, and then what's happening at the other end as the demographics of the baby boomers retire out, there's fewer people to fill those spots than there were 10 years ago, just from that we're producing in the schools of ed throughout the state.
Yeah, it will be very interesting. I am curious if some of the numbers that some of our more rural colleagues have had to face in terms of trying to hire, if that will become real here in Southeast Wisconsin as well. we've been okay. I'm not sure we've been hit. There have been some that are hard to fill, but we've
Yeah.
managed all right.
Well, in part of that, what you have is advantage of now, granted, you got the population densities, but you also have many of the programs are in southeastern Wisconsin. So there are 41, let me see here, 41 providers. Yeah, last year, 41 providers. And of that group, basically from the Fox Valley, Milwaukee area, Racine, Kenosha, and then Dane County, you've got 31. So the vast number of providers are within a couple of hours of you.
Mhm. Well, and some
So
of the bigger ones, even, if I look at people in education, particularly, be it Milwaukee, Marquette, Parkside, Whitewater, there's some of the big ones that serve a lot of kind of our population are really quite close.
correct, yeah. I mean, so
Cardinal
you're
Stitch,
having them all available
yep,
nearby,
yep.
definitely helps you in that vis-a-vis, if we're up in the northwestern part of the state where there's just a couple of providers in the northern tier. But that's always something when you look at how you construct a pay plan, is not only the supply and demand issues, but then also that even if you had the supply, the cost of onboarding that individual and the amount of time it takes to get them so that they are fully ingrained into the system.
Yeah, I feel like it's about a 2-year journey minimally with full onboarding, whether it's a new teacher project or something similar to that.
Mm-hmm.
Toby, how much time is left for the groups?
Looks like 6 minutes on my clock.
6
Okay.
minutes.
And Bob, do you think that that's enough? Should we give them a few extra minutes? I know that once you get into those groups, the time flies, and I know that we were kind of hedging between.
Yeah, I may give them 1 or 2 extra minutes on it just because I think they're going to take a fair amount of time, particularly on the first couple, the first group, because there's
Toby,
a lot of.
Is that something you can do? Can you add time, or is that not possible?
I'm not sure if I can while they're still in it, but I will. I'll try to figure that out.
Well, if you can, okay, great. Maybe we add 5 minutes, and if you can't, hey, so be it.
Okay. No, it doesn't let me change the time once they're in it.
Okay, then we'll go with it.
Okay.
It was meant to be.
Now that the time is up, it will let me extend it. Do you want me to extend it?
Oh, sure. If you can give them another 5 minutes, that'd be great.
Okay.
I'm sure they'll be appreciative.
Josh is joining us now.
Hey guys, sorry for being late.
Oh, hey, Josh.
Hey,
No
Josh,
worries.
thanks for joining us.
I'm assuming they're in breakout rooms if I saw your thing correctly. And
They
it-
are, and we just assigned them 5 more minutes. So
Okay. Nope,
maybe-
that's fine. I'll just wait. I did read through that stuff. So I got kind of a, ballpark idea. I'm not sure exactly where the conversation, of course, went when you guys started, but I did have an opportunity during the day to this afternoon to read through it. So
Yeah, and we haven't
Perfect.
had any conversation other than on the demographics. So what they've done is, what they're doing right now is they've been broken into the groups,
okay.
and then the groups are reflecting on a certain number of questions. So like group number 1 has the what are the 3 biggest strengths, what are the 3 biggest weaknesses, and similar to last time, they'll discuss it amongst themselves. They'll have a spokesperson, a note taker, and then they'll come out and say, this is what we glean from this data. And then what does this foretell for potential changes, if any, to the compensation plan?
Okay. Awesome. Cool. So exciting times, exciting times.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is funny to read it because I mean you do, or at least I guess you kind of get out of it what you want. I was trying not to do that when I was reading it. Like, you have this preconceived notion of what you think people are going to say. So then when somebody says it, you're like, oh yeah, see, I knew that.
Yeah,
And
right.
then there's like 20 more statements before you get to the next one. So you're trying not to do that, but it is hard with all that feedback that way.
Yeah, fighting the confirmation bias is something
Yes,
all
sir.
humans struggle with, right?
Yes, sir. So
No, I thought I was telling Steve in the group beforehand, Josh, that the group did a really good job of responding to it, and that those qualitative answers are very helpful.
Yeah.
I mean, they're very helpful in looking at stuff.
I don't know exactly what the number is, and I don't know if Steve maybe mentioned or maybe he doesn't know offhand, but it seems like a pretty good turnout rate. I mean, it looked at about 75% maybe.
I think, Josh, if my numbers are correct, we had on the turnout, there was 224.
Oh,
And
yeah.
if we do all certified staff, it's 252. So that's 89%.
Yeah. So,
And it may actually be a little bit better because the 252 includes all the little increments of part-time people. And so I mean, I really think that is a positive response, which we did kind of share that just a little bit at the front end, because we certainly think that adds credibility and fidelity to the conversation. And so that, that's awesome. And the fact that, people provided as much qualitative feedback as they did, whether it confirms certain things or it leads to some, next set of questions or wonderments, there's a lot here, which is great.
when I was reading through it, you can infer certain things, like, you saw a couple of people mention, like retirement. You saw other people mention starting salaries and things like that. And I don't know if Bob can even still hear me, but at one time we talked about being able to like click buttons and be able to see, what, the demographic of 0 to 10 is looking for versus the demo. You're able to kind of do that on your side, Bob?
Yes, I am. Yep, I can do that. And I think that's something we'll probably do in the future when we look at that, because of the point you bring up, Josh, about starting pay. It's obviously relevant, as it would be also for, we can see what the responses are for people who only have a bachelor's degree, for example, or for people who have 20 plus years of service.
So there's a lot of playing with that kind of stuff that you can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah. And I think the other things, just for your sake, in trying to get my lens from seeing this in other districts, you have a higher than average percentage of your staff with a master's degree. Okay. So which based on the structure compensation plan makes sense, and for the district putting value on that further education. What was also interesting was there's a pretty noticeable gap between the actual number of years of service someone has in the district versus their total teaching years. So that clearly the district will hire and does hire people who have outside experience. Mm-hmm. So then how does that play into how does that person get ingratiated in under the pay system, et cetera?
You've mentioned that, and this is pre-Steve. So, certainly, something else that he's walked into here at Burlington, but that you had made mention, where those people get placed. If somebody's been in the district for 5 years, outside the district for 5 years, and they get placed, we had that exact event, happen maybe about 5 years ago, I would say. Yeah. And it was just funny listening to you talk about it, because I'm like, do you know that happened here? Because it was so right on target. It kind of made me laugh, and I'm not sure. I don't think many people probably caught it, because I think it was pretty much behind the scenes stuff, but it was funny listening to you, like, good, that stuff happens everywhere,
Yeah, it does. And before you came on, I was sharing with Steve some of the data at a state level that gets reported to the Department of Education on people in teacher certification programs and then degree completers. So people actually complete a degree, and it's probably not newsflash to you, Josh, but overall the number of degree completers is down 31% if you look 10 years prior. And so as you get that confluence of baby boomers, response to the pandemic, you have a smaller group of people who are able and certified to step in.
Yeah.
The only silver lining was the last year the data came out, there were more people entering the programs than there had been in the prior 6 or 7 years. But that'll take, they have to stick with it, because that's just, who's in that program at that snapshot of time. So it's going to be interesting to see what that next line number is. And we won't see that until October of 21. But I think the takeaway from it is that I share with groups or with boards and administration when I meet with them. And again, this is some respect, new perspectives are the obvious, but there isn't, the cavalry's not coming. There's not a massive number of new people, and you couple that in with the costs it takes to do that professional development for someone in their first 5 years. and the return you get on that. So you just have to be, cognizant of how you maintain those people. So in the demographics that we point out, Josh, before you got on, you have about 24% of the staff with 1 to 3 years of service. So there's a big cohort of people just in that block.
All right. Look at all those smiling faces.
Yeah, Josh, we were also, I mean, it was kind of interesting, even with people in that 1 to 3 year range, the percentage of staff, almost half that have that 9 or less, in BASD. And I don't know what that felt experience is, for someone like yourself, that certainly puts you on in the more veteran category, and it probably doesn't feel like it.
It depends who sometimes walking around the hall, at least I get to see old Mr. Groin around there. So that makes it a little bit better, but yeah, it does
I had to find him on my screen to see if he was laughing.
It does get a little harder every year, because I mean, I look it, but I'm not even that old. But yeah, when you start going through, I saw Doc Martinez, ironically enough, who was a principal my first couple of years, this past week at a baseball game, and we were kind of talking, and he was asking questions of who was still there and who wasn't. And as you can imagine, he's been gone for a while now, but a lot of it been gone. Other remembers, Penny remembers, but yeah, not a lot. So
it's just interesting when you see the sort of our demographics broken down like this.
Mm-hmm.
It tells just a slightly different story of how we might normally look at things. All right, well, welcome back, everyone. In the middle of that, we decided maybe an extra few minutes might be appreciated, and I bet it still felt like a rush because there's just a lot of data there. And so we're going to try to, our goal is going to be to kind of plow through it anyway. There were 3 groups, and we're thinking that in all likelihood, each group is going to need probably about 20 minutes to sort of talk and share, but as well for us to have discussion and some Q&A time as a whole group, knowing that it's a little difficult to navigate this setting, but we can certainly do our very best. And I know that as we're listening, we're probably all going to be kind of taking notes a little bit. If the people that were the note takers, though, could email those or take a picture of them and send them or something, but get those to Toby so that we don't miss anything when that can happen later on after the meeting, but that's just helpful for us if you can. So who is our reporter for group 1, the spokesperson for group 1? All right, it's Jack.
I have that job. I'll kick us off.
Thank you, Jack.
So before we start, there are, some people will call some things a strength, and then at the same time, it'll be in the weakness category. For example, like the competitiveness of our system. There were a lot of, that's a real strength. And then there was a lot of, that was weaknesses. And we kind of assumed on, that's kind of where they were in terms of their educational career and in education and experience. So some of those things will fall kind of in both categories here as we go. So the strengths we thought were pretty clear, and there were a lot of people who thought the same thing, is that it was clear and predictable. It felt transparent to a lot of people. And that the current matrix values longevity, education, and then loyalty to the district. So there were clear-cut values in terms of how people were compensated. I don't know. You want me to pause here, or you want me just to run through what we got?
If you could just go through it, yeah, that'd be great, Jack.
All right. So that kind of moves on to the weaknesses, and that list was a little bit longer. There was a lot of opinions in that. One was the idea of freezing the steps and lanes. What was predictable and clear, when that started to happen, became not as clear because it's happened numerous times. Schedule B came up quite a bit in terms of not being compensated appropriately to what they brought to the district and other areas besides in the classroom. That it costs money to create more income. Credits are expensive, and a master's degree isn't expensive, and that is the only path currently to a higher income. Every other year with the steps and lanes kind of hit the brakes, I guess some people thought, in terms of their progress, and then you throw the freezes in there. What they thought was a clear next step and path to higher income gets paused and slowed down compared to where it was probably 10 years ago. There was other people thought that there's other ways to improve as a teacher besides just educational credits, whether that's skills gained by doing something else besides gaining credits, whether that's, if you're in the business world perhaps, and maybe you have experiences in the private sector, but that's not compensated. The max tier came up numerous times, where once you kind of hit that max number in terms of pay, maybe lack of incentive to gain more credits educationally or to gain other skills because there's no financial incentive to do so. Insurance, that big one came up numerous times as really impacting compensation as a whole, as we all know. And then there was just a few questions that we had when someone's hired. We just weren't sure on the process, where they just slotted, so you have this many years and this is your education. There's just probably rumors that go around that that's just not clearly stated when you hire somebody, that they are just slotted into a system. There are just questions. Can you negotiate? Or people have heard that people have negotiated that when maybe that wasn't the case. And then the only, question that we really had moving forward was, I was hoping that some of this information could be disaggregated with, you can kind of guess where people are in terms of years experience in education based on what they thought were strengths and weaknesses. I was maybe that's in the future, hoping to see, how that correlated with who wrote what for strength and weaknesses in terms of their years in education.
Yeah, and we can do that, Jack, as we go forward. That's a good point to try to see if there's any sort of obvious demographic characteristics as to how people answer these questions based on years of service and or educational attainment or the area in which they're teaching. Jack, was there anything else from the group before we open it up for discussion and questions?
Those were my notes. So that's what I have. If anybody else wants to jump in because I missed something, feel free.
Nice job, Jack. That sounded fairly synthesized.
Our group we really got after it in those 25 minutes we were together.
Yeah, you had a heavy lift. There's a lot of qualitative answers in there. So a lot of things to think about. So for the group as a whole, whether you had the chance to read through them prior to the meeting or things that Jack just reported out, there are questions that you have or comments you want to make based upon what you heard Jack report out? Anyone?
Well, I just have a thought though. With the things that you reported, like you said, nobody, we're never going to get all staff to fully agree, but the things that kind of kept coming up were the, transparency, clear, direct, follow through. So I think with any compensation model, at least if we can do those things and make sure everybody's knowing exactly what it is, how to achieve things, and then it's, sustainable to follow through, I think that will be really important, because those are some things that are currently not looked upon well, that aren't technically even the compensation model. It's like how it's executed, right? So just kind of thinking of that as we move forward and how we communicate that.
That's a good point.
I would agree with Jack, and if that's possible to get, and I think we can all make some generalizations on where people are in years with the district or age probably on why they said what they said. But, you know, the one that he started his whole introduction with when he was explaining their summary was people are really happy with it or they don't feel it's competitive. And that, you know, is that the older teachers that made it across and they're in that sweet spot of the step and lanes and they were getting honored every year or not? You know, I'm just, you know, what do our younger teachers feel? Do they feel that it's competitive? You know, because the other thing I noticed on those, and just again, there were people that thought 40,000 was a great, you know, starting salary, and then others felt that it wasn't competitive. And in our little side group with our group, we were kind of hearing the sweet spot for, we're kind of right in the middle, that they're hearing friends that are about 38,000, and then we're also hearing 43, and so we're kind of right in the middle there. So those are just, it'd be nice to see that broken down a little bit to make sure that the, you know, the range of voices are being heard on how our district makeup of certified staff is.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Eric, because that's something I saw in reading through them. And Jack, you report on this as well. You'll see things where someone says it's predictable, it's foreseeable, and then people put in the criticisms. Well, yeah, it's predictable, but I only get it every other year. You know, so, and if someone's been in the district for a longer tenure, I'll open that up to Eric, Josh, any of the others who've been in the system for a while. My hunch is based on things you shared before that wasn't always the case. That the predictability was, it was an annual adjustment. And then, so depending on how long you've been in the system, if I've only been in the system 3 years, Eric, to your remarks, it may not seem predictable because I got it once out of 3 years or twice out of 3 years, depending on where I fell into the cycle. Where if I've been here 27 years, I got probably the majority of the years I was present.
Yeah, it's been the schedule was condensed at one time, Bob, where we had like 15 steps, but you got it every year with steps and half steps and so on and so forth. And then after Act 10, it was froze for a while, then went every other year with a condensed schedule. And you know, I think what people are referring to was I would assume most of those people are referring to this past year when there wasn't steps, would be my guess. If you're within 9 years, I think that would be the only time that you'd be aware of it. Let's put it that way.
Okay. And then there was another one, Jack, thanks, Josh. There was one that you reported out about the weaknesses with respect to new hires and how they are slotted for placement on the grid.
Yeah, I didn't know if that was necessarily, I guess it would be a weakness. I just don't think it's overly clear to everybody else when someone else is hired where they're slotted. You know, there were questions on, I heard people are negotiating their salaries, or I heard that, you know, and as opposed to, no, this is exactly where it is. And Connie clarified that, at least for me, in our conversation.
You know, I think it's a relevant question. I would say that has come up in every compensation committee that I've worked with, as to the reality that there is this free agency market and people do their individual negotiations, but at the same time, what are the parameters and the conditions placed upon that? And so if the committee at the end of that, of our work, is something that clearly articulates how it's done in a global environment, but then also for district record keeping purposes, if there is anything that's deviated from the strict, here's exactly where you should be, that information is detailed so Steve and the administrative team know why those deviations occurred, so they can be justified to the board as the board has to vote to approve those deviations. And Steve, I don't know if you want to comment on how that's done presently or not. And
yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by the question, because I think kind of what happens maybe to Jack's, you know, group one, is that it really is the former, where, you know, somebody comes in and they have X amount of experience and they have X degree and they get slotted in. And so, for example, then Ruth and her office maintain a list of, here's every science teacher certified in the whole district, and here's where their years of service are and experience are, and we try to slot them in. I also think, though, that there are people who probably are saying, well, but I'm trying to negotiate where I slot in. And so I think there is some truth to that perception as well, from, you know, just my own personal experience in the couple of years of being, you know, with Burlington, is that we might say to someone, oh, well, we see that you're going to be at step 6 and you have a bachelor's plus whatever. And they might come back and say, well, wait a minute, but I have all this other experience over here, or you're not counting this. Did you miss that? And really, I've got more than these 15 credits. And so I do think that people's sort of self-advocacy is probably seen as they're negotiating, but really what it's doing is trying to get to be slotted in at the correct spot. And I think, you know, Josh probably knows this too, because there have been some conversations where we've said, gee, we'd really like to hire person, you know, Q. Problem is that they don't sort of fit into the placement in our system. And I would say, regardless of what comes out of this work and this committee's work and this committee's recommendations, one of the things that I would very much like is to understand some of what Jack's group just articulated as weaknesses. And, you know, so I heard two things that for me were a little asterisks. And one was there's costs to create income, and that being also relative to ways to improve as a teacher or as a certified staff member. And so it is interesting that there are some people who, as of late, have come to us, don't have a master's degree, have a long laundry list of credentials. And then the question becomes, do those credentials match, mirror, are they seen as an equivalent to a master's degree, yes or no? And that is the hardest position to be in, frankly. And so as we hire, and when we looked at the demographic information, where I think it was maybe number 5, where, you know, Bob's summary was, we're not reluctant to hire staff with experience. I can tell you, on the receiving end of us trying to do that, when an interview team says this is the person we want, that is getting harder to hire people with experience, because they might be coming from a system that is less structured than this and gives administration more leniency, authority, flexibility to place them. And so that's just something that when I hear both strengths and weaknesses, the hiring piece, you know, a lot of folks have said that, well, we want to make sure we have a plan that's attractive, that retains, that recruits. So that will just be something that is a kind of a takeaway for me in this conversation as well as I'm listening. So hopefully that kind of addresses is that happening? I really think we're trying to place people as best we can, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of the optics are, oh no, well, there's negotiations. I would say not really.
Just wanted to add, Steve, to that we do have some, on occasion, some off-scale placements in very, very hard to fill areas. And so that may be something that's also, you know, been out there, is that, you know, technical education, family and consumer science, you know, some highly sought after physics teacher, that's something that is really difficult to fill. And maybe there's 2 applicants or 1 applicant, and in order to get someone to fill that position, but those are rare and are exceptions rather than the norm, which is what you described earlier, which is typically we look at years of experience and education and then go to the scale and say, here's where you would fit, and slot that individual in. So just want to clarify that there are some, but very rare occasions where there's an off-scale placement.
Yeah, thank you, Connie. And I just think so the whole group knows, as Bob pointed out, the sort of handbook language says that if it is modified, it's modified with school board discretion. And so usually that would mean is that, like, Connie or I would need to take that to the school board and explain why they're being paid sort of off grid. And that is pretty rare. So yeah, thank you for that, Connie.
Can I add one more clarification? Just on the years of experience, we do go back and try to treat them as if they were always a BASD employee and do steps every other year. So it's not 5 years of experience means step 5. We go back and look at if they've been here 5 years, they stayed at step 1 for 2 years and step 2 for 2 years. Just so you know, we're doing that behind the scenes as well, trying to keep that on the level playing field as much as we can.
Yeah, I was just gonna add that, like, from the principal perspective, okay, this is the candidate we want. We look at how many credits, years of experience, we call Ruth. From what I see on the salary schedule, it's here. Ruth, would you concur with that? And it's always thinking back of if they were always with us with that many years, you know, just like Ruth said. But it is fairly set and very standard, like everybody's saying, from our lens of when we're hiring.
So Jill, do you think that's more of a messaging issue that, you know, that's communicated more frequently to staff as to this is how we do this? So people, it's kind of like pulling the curtain back. Because I know in other districts, there's that perception sometimes that someone from outside the system can do better with the experience calculation. And in fact, in some circumstances, employees said, so is the solution I have to quit and then get rehired and then I'll get bumped up? So do you think that's a messaging issue? What do you think it is that's the genesis for those answers?
Well, my opinion a little bit would be that other school districts, you can do that a little bit more. So there might just be some overarching like, oh, in all school districts, you can now negotiate. Where in our district, really, that's not something that can be done except for those super rare situations. So I think it's more probably just because we're surrounded by districts that do negotiate more than we do. But
Okay.
I could be wrong on that. It's a good question for the teachers.
Anybody else want to comment on that from a staff person, teacher perspective?
I think that teachers are aware that that has happened in our district, and that's where it's coming from.
Okay. Another thing that jumped out to me was in those weaknesses, and Jack, you had reported on this, was the cost for credits, basically like the down payment I have to make in order to get the pay increase. As staff members, have you heard that from particular cohorts of staff? I mean, Eric's right, I can disaggregate the data and we can use it, you know, look at it interactively at some point further down the road. But just anecdotally, have you heard that from certain segments of the staff? And what's the sentiments? You know, is it people with a bachelor's degrees, people new to education, both?
I hear it across the board for anybody that's making that investment to move, whether that's from bachelor's to bachelor's plus 15 or from a bachelor's to a master's or master's to master's 24. I mean, it's a financial investment in today's college world where people are looking at, all right, this is going to cost me 10 grand now, but I'm going to reap the benefits of $6,000 for 20 years to come, hypothetically speaking. So it definitely, it's not a new issue. I mean, it's some people that just have their masters and going. It is, I mean, people do look at it as an investment, even people that have been here as long as myself who, you know, at one time there was credit reimbursement, you know what I mean? And then a lot of these people that have been 10 years or less, credit reimbursement doesn't exist at all inside of the district. So it really is, I think most people look at it as an economic investment that do it.
Anything else on that? I think Josh summed up what I heard in other districts, but anything else on that point?
I was just going to
Heather?
agree with Josh. I think he's right that even those of us who continue to get credits, even though you don't have to anymore, they're still looking at it as an investment. And when you're not going to get anything back out of your investment, or that you think you're going to get it at least every other year, someone who just finished a master's degree and now is waiting 2 years to get that 6,000 pay hump, they don't have 2 years before, if they took a loan out of it, before that loan has to be paid on. So that is a economic challenge for them. And then all of a sudden now, if it doesn't happen, now it's 4 years before they get that. And they're paying on a loan for something they thought was guaranteed to be moved on, and it's not being moved on. So I do think that's a huge impact for a lot of people right now.
Yeah, I've heard that same exact message from a few teachers. Mhm.
Thank you, Heather.
I also think, I just wanted to give a comment. I also think that our 23 through 30, let's say 33-year-old group of people, they're viewing it very differently. They're coming out of college a lot more in debt because college did cost a lot more. And they're looking at skills in a totally different way, you know, that they can acquire skills that can help them in the and better themselves better and help the students in a totally different manner. And they don't have any avenue to get compensated, not on the Burlington compensation schedule where, you know, I'm going to say they've heard, you know, in other districts, some of those skill-based type of education advancements are compensated. And so we just don't have an avenue for that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I'll kick that over to Steve or any of the other administration. I know we've talked offline about what other districts are doing there too. And for some of these, been doing it for a while. Some have a very formalized system like a CEU, a continuing educational units. Others will say this particular skill is equivalent to 3 credits or 6 credits, depending on what it is. And I just offering, has the district had any conversations in the past about some sort of equivalency model that would, you know, be more along those lines of specific skill acquisition versus degree acquisition? Not hearing things, so I assume that's a no.
I mean, yeah, and again, I'm sorry, I thought you were asking Steve that question. Those conversations have happened in past years. I mean, that was a conversation that came up after Act 10 when a whole bunch of, you know, there's a bunch of changes, of course, to salary schedules and things like that across the board. And at first, nothing kind of happened. Everybody was froze. And then the decision was to go to this. I mean, we looked at salary schedules again. Now I'm dating this 10 years. So I'm sure there's a lot more options now from what even I can see. At that time, it was hard to find what other districts were doing online unless it was bad enough that it made the paper. The good stuff didn't really make the paper. But it was something that was talked about, and it's very hard. I mean, as I sit here and look at like different people in this room, like some technical skills work better in certain departments than it does in others. You know, I mean, I'm looking at a tech ed teacher right now, and I'm looking maybe at a music teacher or something. It's much more fitting there than like the physics example that you were mentioning, you know, before. So quite honestly, the system kind of got bogged down, and it got hard to. We stopped. I mean, everybody just kind of stopped. And went back to what we had.
Okay, well, it's been very helpful, Jack. Thanks for reporting out. Anything else you want to add on behalf of the group before we kick it over to the next group for their comments and analysis?
Nope.
All right, thanks again, Jack. So Steve, who did we have next?
So we have group 2 coming up next, and that's questions 9, 10, and 11. So we just need to know who the spokesperson is.
I can talk.
Thanks, Julie Beth.
Sure. So we had quite the discussion as well about education, that if you take a look at the results, people value the master's degree, but also skills and also PD. And you know, we said in some cases, there's some graduate credits that really are not like better than getting an additional certification. And we also brought up the old CEU system that DPI used before the PDPs rolled out. And that, you know, maybe we need to take a look at something like that again. That one person said that, you know, some of the webinars or one-day classes that you go to, workshops, can give you so much information that you can take back and use in your classroom tomorrow. And, you know, you can take an entire course as part of a master's program. And because you're getting the full master's, you have to take some required courses that might not have anything to do or don't translate into your classroom at all. And so it seemed as though everybody valued education and professional development, but looking at ways to do not just a master's, to look at other skills as well, like Jack reported out. Another thing that was a really common thing was that student learning outcomes and basing salary on educator evaluations bothered a lot of people. They felt that it was subjective, that too concerned that there'd be favoritism going on in terms of the evaluations, that you could be ranked very highly and then just have a new associate come in and rank you low, and is that going to somehow harm your salary, and that's out of your control. Student learning, we talked about, you don't choose who's in your classroom. If you're picking up a remedial class, or you have a class that's higher in special needs students or reluctant learners, or students who are struggling, that looking at that outcome when they don't care about the ACT, they don't care about the Aspire, and to have that reflect on our salary is something that a lot of people really bristled against. Another key thing was the market of incentives. It didn't seem like many people ranked that highly, but somebody pointed out, but there aren't that many people that fall into that category. As Connie said, that, it's really rare for that to come up where you're trying to like slide people around on the pay schedule, that maybe it's ranked lower because that's not there. But also, we don't want to create resentments in the rest of staff when somebody is brought in one of those hard to fill positions, that that needs to be talked about. I guess I'm not expressing that one very well. And then finally, we talked a bit about BASD experience versus overall experience, and why that was even in there. And said that, like, knowing the community and knowing the students, that's really important, and being a part of BASD is something. But looking at the survey results, just overall experience was ranked higher than BASD experience. And so we felt that, like, most people felt that being experienced was more important than just being at Burlington. And if my group could help me out, if I missed anything, please speak up.
I think, excuse me, Julie Beth, you hit it really well with like experiencing some learning experience and bringing it into your classroom. And then another thing though we talked about is, you have some people have topped out on their credits and hours and all of that, and then they might not do any more continuing ed because they, maybe don't have to, or, it's not as of value to them. And I think somebody made a comment, like, we always want our teachers learning and growing to like improve student outcomes. Like, it was, it's a crucial piece in better instruction and being better for kids. So just thinking possibly, like, when we're kind of talking about like micro credentials, how can we all encourage growing in a way that might not be a financial burden?
I added it.
Is this are we ready to ask a question? And it's not really towards Julie Beth, well, maybe Julie, I know you were somewhere else, but more for anybody, but probably Bob with his experience. You hear this talk of traditional and then what I would consider maybe a more modern compensation schedule with continuing. Everybody I know that's a professional, it's like continuing education hours. You know what I mean? It's not necessarily degrees and things like that, but more like hours. I'm thinking like healthcare and things of that nature. Bob, are you aware of school districts that have some kind of, both options available to you? Like, all right, 12 credits is worth this many continuation education hours. And then a master's degree, you would need this many continuing education hours.
Yes.
I don't know if my question is clear or not.
Oh,
but
no, it
seems like
is,
we could
Josh.
have
Yeah.
both.
Yeah, no, there are many districts who went to that model. And then part of that is what you put in that whole basket of equivalency. And I think those that have been more successful, and I'd say successful as far as it's been sustainable, it's stayed in time, and it's clearly articulated and people know what it is and seem to stay with it and hasn't spurned turnover, is where things would be like some of the early examples that were given. So I think, Steve, maybe you were the one that said, the person is project lead the way. That is equivalent to X number of CEUs. And so some districts would say one college credit equals 15 hours of X. And project lead the way might be equivalent to 90 hours. So there's some tracking mechanism. The pros and cons with it, I think if it's set forth in my personal experience when I've seen it work, if it's relatively straightforward and it's limited to things you'd actually say are outside education. I had to go take this. So, I had to go get this micro credential somewhere that I can then bring back to my classroom. Where it became more problematic for districts like one that launched it and they got rid of it after a year or two, they were giving those points for a lot of things that were valued. So it wasn't, don't take this as that these things aren't valued, but it's trying to equate them to credits. Was, well, I'm also a peer mentor. Should I get quote unquote credits for that? Because I learned both being a mentor and for the teacher I'm working with versus having that segregated in an add-on schedule, whether it's an extra duty pay, part of an extracurricular activity. And those become difficult conversations because and I saw that in the responses to here, there's a lot of comments about club activity, extracurriculars, et cetera, which my reading of that was, okay, maybe that's an area that the district needs to also talk about as to what does that schedule look like? How does that function? Most districts have kept that though segregated from the pay plan for being a teacher. So whether I choose to be a club advisor or not doesn't influence my salary schedule placement, but that doesn't mean we don't talk about what club advisors make and what kind of investments we make to attract and retain people as club advisors. So I think, Josh, the quick answer to your first part, yes, very common, lots of examples that we could find and share, with the caveat of once it gets into extra duties, then that's when it started to get a little muddy for some districts. Yeah, Heather?
I'm also part of group 2, and we actually did also talk about all of those extra duties. And Jill brought up a good point that I think a lot of those comments come from, I don't know that our Schedule B has been looked at for a long time, and pay has stayed the same for a long time. And we're wondering if people start to confuse that with that they don't feel like they're getting paid enough for those positions, that might be a separate conversation almost than the actual compensation part is, but that it obviously is on a lot of people's minds, and needs to probably be something that we think about or talk about at some point.
I think that's a great point, Heather. And what I was referencing earlier was in one district so this is back 8 or 9 years ago. So they went and created a new pay system relatively quickly. They had their core compensation plan. And the moment that got done, they launched a new committee exclusively on extra duty and co-curriculars, and then brought in people to look at those areas and come up with formulas so that if anyone ever questioned, why does the track coach make this? Why does the musical director make this? Everything was clearly articulated. And then they hooked it onto the schedule, that they had created from the compensation committee so that it would rise automatically with that. Now they may still have to look at it from time to time if you have, the formula was try to be driven by supervision responsibilities, length of season or activity, number of students involved, et cetera. But if something changed at the state level, so if suddenly they put a new requirement on DECA, then you'd go back and look at that co-curricular pay system. But I think clearly from what I read in that, I think you're right on the mark, Heather. That's what I read in those answers, that people want to have that viewed, and they felt, well, here's an opportunity to get my viewpoints expressed.
How have districts been able to do that without some type of referendum? Because when you're dealing with in this land of CPI, and then you've got your insurance increase, it does seem like we're almost rearranging the chairs on the Titanic to a certain degree if you're dealing with a fixed amount of income like education typically is, without some type of operating referendum. So if you're going to pay club advisors and coaches more, that money has to come out of some type of pool.
Correct. Yeah. Well, and there have been some that have done that. They've looked at other structuring issues as far as, and there's always push-pull on this, and this is where the board gets involved of, well, are there clubs that are still viable or not? What is the cost per student, so to speak? And on the flip side, this is one point I'll interject my own personal beliefs on. If I go into a school district and say, hey, I've got something that if you spend money on it, you'll have higher graduation rates, fewer disciplinary referrals, better attendance, and higher basically overall, or less drug and alcohol abuse, you're interested in investing in that. I mean, who's going to say no? And I think, Josh, you're nodding your head, you know what it is. It's clubs and sports. All the data shows that if you have students engaged in those activities, those are the outcomes you're going to get. And so Steve's familiar with districts that they've set as a goal, we want every single student participating in something, because we can save we save in other areas and we promote academic achievement. So that's going out and doing. You can work closely with booster clubs as well if you don't want to go to referendum. So you create foundations. So there are financial sources to do it. The cost of districts when I've done it is actually not as great in that area as you would think on first blush, because as Heather mentioned in some of the responses are, the increment, you can give fairly large percentage increases and they're not generating huge dollar amounts because the numbers are low, to be quite honest, as you guys know. You're giving 5% off of $4,000 is not the same as giving 5% off of 50,000.
I had a point to raise. Can I jump in?
Absolutely,
I was also,
Peter.
Thanks. And I was also a Group 2 member. And Julie Beth, thanks for summarizing things. I thought it was interesting, though, when I looked at question 9, which was the survey data, advanced degrees was number 1. And I question, because of Bob, what you mentioned, we have a very high rate of advanced degrees, whether there was some bias built into the answers. Plus, we heard from a lot of respondents throughout the survey that there was obviously concern in the staff that we're not going to honor, folks who got their masters or spent money on getting credits. And as a non-educator in this group, my question is, if we could start over with a blank slate, not saying that we'll do that, but just as educators, what do you think would be better that we incentivize? Would it be college credits, or would it be other kind of things like we just talked about, professional development or micro credentials, which I never heard of before tonight, or other things? What, as educators, what would you like to see us do as a district?
From what other people have said that I've talked to, they would like opportunities to be able to move on the salary scale without getting a master's degree. There are some people that have required certificates they have to do every year. But I said, if we do that, we have to make sure we provide an opportunity for everyone to be able to move on the scale, no matter if they're going for their master's or if they're taking workshops, attending conferences. We just have to make sure that we're trying to include like everyone in some way they'll have the opportunity to move on the scale.
I mean, I really valued my master's. I think I became a much better teacher because I went through that process. Where it ranks compared to other things, I don't know, because I haven't done the skill-based stuff maybe as someone who's been in the private field, but I valued my master's. I think when it was all said and done, I am a much better educator because I took those courses and went through that struggle.
I agreed too, like with my master's, and as an organization, I think you want to show that you have highly trained teachers. And one way to do that is through your master's degree. But I don't think that is the only way. You know, I think if we do these other credentials or something, it's got to be in a really like meaningful way, that it's showing that I'm not just, you know, sitting passively watching a podcast or screencast, whatever. I'm also like growing and implementing it. And I think it should translate into really affecting your practice. Yeah.
Well, I know we were talking group 3 about those teachers that when they get to, you know, the 50,000 mark, we'll say, for because they don't have a master's, you know, are they much different than somebody who is, you know, has a master's and is making significantly amount, you know, more money? For me, you know, when I'm looking at this is, you know, you look at the master's as an investment, and it, you know, it's really, as Jack is going to say, I think it has improved, you know, the quality of your teaching as you go, and it's a significant amount of money to, you know, to invest, and so you get nervous when you are looking at in the next couple of years. You know, for me, I'm hopefully by the end of the year I'll have my master's. I think a big concern is, will we still have that same jump, you know, or will that, you know, we're nervous. I know a couple of different people that are nervous about, you know, when we put that huge investment and we have that, you know, sight set on that set amount, and then, you know, possibly, well, are we going to have that amount, or, you know, is it going to be cut a little bit, or, you know, whatever that might look like, or frozen for the year? We get, you know, there's a lot of people that are concerned with that. So, and, you know, for me, experience and a master's, I think both of those are, you know, important. As, you know, when you have experience, you know, you tie that master's in, you're going to have, you know, a quality teacher. So.
I think that's very good input. Peter, did that help you there?
Absolutely. No, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, I think one other thing that I've seen in districts, Peter, on this has been that you have a big labor market factor. And so there were some districts early on that were going to either not pay for the master's degree anymore or pay considerably less. And that strategy didn't really last, because the neighboring districts or districts even out of state were still emphasizing the master's degree. And so that really was almost as if, even if you didn't want to value it at a certain point, the labor market was telling you had to keep people. It was valued within the field. The other piece of that was staff who looked at the micro credentials. Some would look and say, well, I really value this. The skill is going to be great. But when I go and apply it in a different district, they don't value that. They might in the interview, but they don't pay me any more for it. Now that has changed somewhat over the last 5 years. There's more districts that might be apt to have some flexibility in the pay grid, but many of them still don't. So as you go down that pathway, that's just something that the teacher would have to be aware of. If I get that particular skill, that is a skill that's rewarded in Burlington, which will help you for retention, but may not be transferable to another district, where the master's degree is almost universally transferable.
Bob, I just would add to that too. Interestingly enough, in some ways we're on the inverse of what Bob just described. That we're one of those places that really the master's degree is universal. We recognize that and we can place people there. But as people interview or apply with some of these other certificates, skills, different experiences, other micro credentials, for example, those are the hard ones for us, because we don't necessarily have a system whereby those things can be recognized. So just to put that out there, that it's going in both directions, which makes it tough.
And just to add on to what Steve's talking about, because I've heard that from several administrators across the district, it really does seem like maybe these conversations in the past have been either or. And if I'm hearing Bob correct, it doesn't have to be an either or conversation. It can be a both type conversation where both are avenues depending on what the individual teacher would want. And you would think most people would respond to choice positively.
Yeah, Josh, that has been my recent experience the last few years, that the end products have been more of a combination. And so each teacher can come in, make his or her assessment as to what works for them, whether to go pursue that master's degree, or, you know what, I'm more interested in the micro credentials because that's going to work better for my particular position and where I am financially right now with raising a family or outstanding student loan debt. So the main issue that I always bring up with districts when they go down that pathway is make sure it's manageable, that you have the staff understanding of what they can do with it, and then administration's ability to track it. So I found those that have been relatively straightforward and simplistic. It's lasted. Those who got really complex, where they went to some extremes of, we're going to reward everybody X amount if they take this particular, get this particular micro credential. Well, then the next year the staff go, how about if we get this particular micro credential? And you start stacking onto it versus, and we're going to have more of a process that's going to work. That process goes through an approval process that equates it to academic credit. And I don't know if it was you, Julie, Beth, or whom talked about the CEUs when you were describing that. You know, something that was along those lines. And so that is a little bit more administrative work at the front end for approval, but it does seem to get that flexibility that you're talking about, Josh. Well, I think, you know, to be respectful of everybody else's time, Julie Beth, I think you did a nice job of summarizing the group, so thank you. But I think we need to move on, Steve, to the next cohort. Does that work?
Absolutely. Yep. I was just going to kind of try to push us in that direction as well. So thank you. Who's our team 3 spokesperson?
That is me.
Oh, awesome, Shannon. Thanks.
Okay, so to look at question, I'll just run through all this real quickly. To look at question 12, we looked at our percentages of our staff who were satisfied with our salary. We actually had a significant amount more who agreed, over 50%, but it was noted in our group that we still have about 40% who disagree, and that still is a large amount. As far as competitive and pay administered equally, if you're looking at agreeing very much or disagreeing very much, they're actually pretty equal, if not skewed a little more in favor that people are agreeing with those things. For question 13, what are the reasons that you would stay in the Burlington Area School District? Some of the big topics or big things we're able to lump together were insurance, being compensated for a master's degree, whether that's one you already have or one that you will be having soon, competitive salary, options other than just credits for lane, step, or any kind of advancement, and then maintaining or keeping the post-retirement benefits. Question 14 of why you might leave the Burlington Area School District would be if the district were to stop honoring master's degrees, or if you were not grandfathered in the near future for something you've already started, if the retirement benefits were to go away, if health insurance costs were to go up or become unfeasible. And within that, there was also a subset of comments, people who maybe a married couple and don't think they're getting like fair benefits. If salary were to be cut, or if there were permanent pay freezes. And then this was a smaller group of people, but there were comments about not wanting compensation tied to SLOs, just because that can become very, very subjective. And then as a whole, our group came up with a few suggestions for the pay structure if we ever were to do a modification based on people in our group's comments and just things that we've heard from peers. Some of those suggestions were to, if we're to keep with the steps and lanes, to honor the monetary amounts that are already there. So for example, like if the jump, I don't actually know what it is, but if the jump were, let's say 5,000 from like bachelor to master's for the last group of people, that the new group of people coming up would get the same jump. We could look at years of service and experience versus just credits. Looking at in-district PD or trainings that people could go to and then come back and teach to other people in the district. There was consideration that certain groups, like maybe special ed teachers, have to do additional like committees or different trainings that they could be compensated for. And then there's another thought that psychs and therapists could potentially be on their own pay scale because they are more medical, less education, and they do have a lot of things they need to pay for out of pocket, like that, to keep up with their credentials.
Thank you, Shannon. That's a lot of good stuff there. Did the participants have questions for Shannon and her group? Anybody?
This would be more for administration, but can you say what the current retirement benefit is? Like if you retire at 55, does the district pay all health insurance? Like what, because it seems like a lot of people are worried about losing that. And I guess I'm not fully aware of what that is.
Ruth, I see that
I was
you're
gonna
unmuted.
say,
That
I'm
must
assuming
mean-
you want me to take that one.
Not sure.
I don't have it right in front of me, so I'm going off of memory a little bit, but for the teacher certified staff group, you would need 22 years of experience and have attained at least a bachelor's plus 30 credits. And then you would get 6 years of either family or single health insurance. If you also have your 110 accumulated sick days remaining, you could get another 1 year of family or 2 years of single coverage. And if you had also banked sick days from all these annual, like once you reach the maximum every year, you have the option of getting paid out the remaining annual sick days or banking them. So if you've banked them, then that is converted at the daily sub rate, and you can purchase additional months of insurance based on whatever the premium is at that rate. So everybody would have at least 6 years with the potential to have more than 8.
Yeah, it's 55 and 22 is the main thing. You got to be 55 years old and 22 years of experience in the district. If the experience outside the district does not count, because it's looked at as a district benefit.
Yep, WRS eligibility for eligibility for WRS annuity. Thank you. That would be 55. Thanks for adding that.
Other questions for Shannon and her group? Is there anything that you were, as a group, that you were surprised by in the results in your questions, Shannon? The group said, that this surprised us, or was it pretty much what your team members thought they were going to see in those responses?
Someone else can definitely jump in, but I know for me, I was just surprised how many times like the master's degree thing came up.
It kind of mirrored questions, or not 1 and 2, but 7 and 8. It's some of the similar things that people found were strengths and weaknesses, or it's the same things that's going to keep them or have them go, for that part. But that blending of the comment that we kind of talked on questions 9, 10, and 11 got talked on a little bit too, is are there other things other than credits that why we're always based on credits? There's other areas, and Josh kind of alluded to that, other areas within the school system where, a true credit, it's different certifications, and, that relates to the discussion we just had. So that was some of the other things, right, group, I believe, so.
And can I ask too, the suggestion there toward the end, Shannon, you were talking about sort of in-district PD and trainings, that would be like in lieu as another way to move through the schedule, correct?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I think that was the kind of the idea that like if I went out and get trained in, Ross Green's newest method, and then I can bring value to the district by, presenting to everyone in the district or saving you some money that way, that would be another way to move up the compensation scale.
become a certified trainer for the district in a
Mhm.
method of, yep, everything from teaching to content knowledge. Yep.
Yeah, and there have been districts who've done that, and they've, depending on how they structure, sometimes the district will pay the trainer's costs, and then the trainer will get something for the time doing the training. Otherwise, the trainer will put that burden on themselves to get the training, and then the district will reward them as if they were collegiate credits, and then pay them some hourly rate to be the instructor. And then the people that they're instructing can also get the credits and the certification. So districts have partnered with colleges and universities for that as well. I believe, Steve, your prior district, you were doing that with Edgewood for some items. That's, if I remember properly.
Yep, we were.
So that's an opportunity for synergy where you can get a reduced tuition rate. You still get the collegiate credit, but you're in essence doing it in-house with in-house staff complementing those from the college or the university. Other questions or comments from Shannon's group?
I'm not
Heather?
I'm not in Shannon's group, but I had I guess one of the things you asked, one of the things that kind of surprised me. I was actually happily surprised by how many people really are looking for the other options besides just the master's degree. So those other abilities and other skill sets are the CEU credits potentially are possibly rewarded. I valued my master's degree, but like right now I'm working with a lot of intervention things, and there's not really a degree for intervention programming. It's a lot of courses and there's a lot of conferences. So right now I have no way to get anything out of it. And yet that's of a lot of value to me and a lot of value to my students. And I think a lot of value to the district that I attend those. And I think that it's something we really need to take a look at, because I think there are a lot of areas like that where they aren't necessarily degree programs, but they are valuable to our students and to our district. And I think that's a good thing that people are recognizing that. And I think that's something we need to really talk about.
If
Thank
I
you,
can
Heather.
echo that, Heather, I agree 100% because I have a master's, but then I also have many certs. And I can't really say that one was more valuable to me as an educator than another, but both definitely bring a lot into my classroom. And we really need to have both pathways there.
Thank you, Julia.
Yeah, I was just going to add to, I think, as Heather just sort of alluded to, and what Julie Beth followed up with, one of the things that I've heard from all of the groups tonight is this, whether it was expected or a little bit of a surprise, the idea of trying to find multiple pathways to move through a system. And then also I'm still kind of hearkening back group one and Jack's comment about clear and predictable. And I know that in some of the preparation conversations I've had with Bob, he has shared numerous stories of places where they've overcomplicated things and it perhaps maybe hasn't gone all that well. And so there is this sort of inherent tension in what we're talking about. And it's fascinating that it exposes itself so clearly in this conversation tonight. So I just wanted to kind of point that out as well.
Another thing that was really clear to me just is the concern with the insurance and benefits. And just like we said, like extracurriculars might be another committee. I definitely think this information is telling us people are concerned about that. And so I don't know, excuse me, if that's something, we put into another committee to really look like post-retirement benefits, insurance, and different things like that, just to see if we're serving our staff as best as possible.
I mean, I would just add, just so that the whole group kind of is allowing sort of me the space to say, I hear you. I would compare this much like the work that the board has undertaken with policy work. We knew when we began policy work at the board level that would probably take about a year, and it did. And then we moved on to our administrative guidelines, which are going to take probably another 6 months. We're just wrapping that up. And then that probably will lead to the third sort of piece of that triangle, which is kind of handbook language, code of conduct stuff for kids. So we knew that that was a three-legged stool right out of the gate. I think this conversation for this whole group to know is somewhat the same. We are consistently looking at insurance. There's a special sort of subcommittee that talks about insurance particularly. This is intended to be compensation, but knowing full well, we're not going to exit this discussion without circling back and talking about our Schedule B, particularly as it's been pointed out, it's old. The last time it's been touched, it probably has some good dust on it relative to it being updated. And you just can't do them all at once. And so just for the sake of this conversation, I would offer that it was my intention and understanding to come back to have a separate conversation around Schedule B. And frankly, Schedule B gets a lot more airtime than compensation does. People talk about Schedule B all the time. But I think when we really kind of pause to look at doing things in a sequential and purposeful manner, the total compensation for all staff, I would argue probably has to be done before we then try to figure out what to do with Schedule B. That's just kind of why we're doing this first, but I don't want to be dismissive of the fact that that's going to have to come next.
Anything else for?
Yeah, can I add one more thing, Bob? Sorry for
Peter. No,
interrupting you. But I thought it was interesting, question 12, that it seemed like the staff was fairly evenly split on whether they felt they were fairly compensated. Maybe slightly more agreed, but it was, it's fairly interesting. I wonder if we will consider a market survey at some point, because I don't know the answer to that question either.
I think that's a good point.
I think that Barry, I'm sorry, go ahead, Bob.
You could take the floor, Taylor.
No, I was saying, I think that varies. I think it's been kind of an echoed comment throughout this entire process. I think that varied on where each person was at their level in their career. And that's where I think it's going to be helpful to potentially narrow down some of these comments, as we kind of talked about in group one, is to try to figure out, if there's a way to kind of narrow down some of these comments as to, the person who made, this comment that Peter just mentioned, are they within the bracket of, 1 to 10 years in their, years of service, or is a person then, towards the, end of retirement? I think that'll be kind of helpful with that market survey that you were just talking about, Peter.
Yeah, and we can do that too, and we're at the next meeting to dive into that, in addition to going on to what some of these various answers were. And so I kind of left with some themes in my head to sum it up of, the master's degree. There was clearly a strong interest in retaining it. This concept of having some alternative just to credits. So whether we'll call it CEUs or something else, just to use the same vernacular. The predictability of the existing grid, the clarification of how hiring occurs for outside individuals, the value of overall teaching experience. Those were kind of the themes that I saw this evening. And I'm sure there's others, but I think you did a good job of reporting out the stuff on frankly not having as much notice as I probably would have liked you to have, getting all this data dumped on you and reading it right on the spot. But we wanted to give people the maximum time to answer the survey and have our dialogue when it was still fresh. But I do think it informs us as to where we go forward in looking at this and getting some ideas. And Steve, I'll turn it over to you briefly about maybe what you're thinking about as to next steps as to when to meet and how to meet on this, or whether we need to talk to the board about the planning for this. Because I know your school year comes to a close relatively soon, right?
Yes, that was what I was going to share. I think that originally when we talked about getting the community together, we wanted to at least get to this point where we are right now, that we've been able to put the survey out to staff so that we could get a high response rate, which we did, that we could use this time tonight to try to sort of study this data at a high level. I can't imagine we're done. But some of these themes now are going to allow Bob and I some clarity to follow up, talk about next meeting, next steps. maybe start pulling together some examples from some other districts about how perhaps they're framing, how do you move through the system, so that we can look at some examples. And I think we really want to pay attention to the fact that, you know, we're hearing from folks, we want there to be multiple pathways, but we also want it to be predictable and to be easy and simple, and to know that we have to have some flexibility in terms of hiring, placement, et cetera. And I do feel like it would be reasonable to get with the board. The only other and final last piece that I'll offer is that I recognize that 3 weeks from today is the day where our teachers come back for in-service, and everything, all of the dominoes that are associated with our summer will start to be executed. And so it is not lost on me that we're probably not going to talk about compensation for at least 3 more weeks. And that some of you have asked, look, if we're going to have a summer conversation, can we get that on our calendar sooner than later? That will be a priority for sure to get that out. The good/bad news is we don't have a lot of updated information on the state of our state budget yet. And so that's kind of looming out there as well. But I will certainly be sure to follow up once Bob and I've had a little chance to try to take all the information from tonight and distill it into those few key points that are going to guide us in our next piece of the conversation. There's a lot of information here, and yeah, you distilled it quickly and quite succinctly, and so certainly my appreciation. Any other closing comments, Bob or Peter? Don't want to put you on the spot. If there's just anything else for the good of the group from anyone.
I just thought you had a really good dialogue, and I really appreciated the job that your spokespeople did for reporting out from your groups and how you elicited the data from that that's relevant to what we're talking about. So thank you for your work on that. Greatly appreciated.
I just have a quick comment about when we were looking at these weaknesses. And I don't know if it's something that maybe at the district level that somebody might want to send out an email, because it seems like there are a lot of people that are like panicking about the fact that they're getting this master's degree. And I think they're worried that next year we're going to have a completely separate salary schedule and they're not going to get compensated for what they've already put money into and took out student loans for. And I mean, that might be something that somebody would, you know, at the administrative level would want to like maybe calm a little bit of fears about, because there were a lot of comments in the weaknesses about, and when we were talking about people, things that might make people leave the district. And there were even some people that are like, I'm looking for a job now because I got this master's degree and I'm not getting paid for it. And it got frozen on the salary. We got frozen and we may never get it now. So I don't know. It was just a thought that I had.
No, thank you, Dana. I think that that's a good point. And I am happy to do that. I would also encourage all of you as ambassadors to this process to try to calm those fears from people. I recognize that there are never any promises, but I will say that the conclusions that I at least hear that people jump to are pretty extreme. And I would hope that that's never the reality, is that there's never those kind of quick extreme movements. So anything that any of you can do to also spread that word, to say that's, you know, that's not the conversation that we're having, and anything that's a net result of our work with this committee is not something that's going to be in place by July 1 for this next year anyway. And we began this process by saying we're not talking about next fall. So hopefully that can help calm people down, but I appreciate that, Dana, and I'll definitely got a note of that right here.
Steve, just to go along with that conversation, I know it's kind of been talked about going into next fall. Can you plan on staying on the schedule for next year? Is that the plan? Are we planning on freezing it already? I mean, I just think with a lot of uncertainty that was just brought up in conversation, I think, you know, we are just very nervous. People in my spot specifically, that was just spoken about. You know, do you guys already know if it's gonna be frozen, or, you know, I just think there's a lot of people in my spot.
Let me jump in on that one too. I mean, there has been no discussion about freezing, and it was very difficult decision this year to freeze. And the part of the challenge is, as everyone knows, is we're struggling as a school district to know we have uncertain funding. And that is very difficult to deal with. But the goal, I think, overall of this compensation is to be fair. So that going back to your point, Deb, I think that is great that we try to reassure everybody that we're not trying to switch the system and pull the rug out from anybody. I mean, and we are we recognize that people invested money on getting their credits and potentially their master or getting their master's degree, and it would be unfair to switch systems and unfairly compensate people.
Well, and that's the point. There's only so much money that is there at this point. So, I think that there needs to be some consideration into that as well. So, just reading some of these comments that, if you don't have a plan in place, just as a general comment, I'm going to go. I mean, I think that's a little unfair to the school district, but I also understand where the frustration is coming in for that comment. So I get both sides of it, but again, Peter's point, I mean, nobody is going into this with any type of malicious intent to try to pull the rug out from any staff member here whatsoever. It's just, there's only so much we can do.
Sorry, the questions I've heard from people aren't necessarily about switching compensation models by next year, but just knowing specifically if it would be unfrozen. So if people are expecting it, can they expect that raise to come? So not saying, oh, are we going to micro credentials, whatnot, but just, for things that were missed this year, are they going to be caught up? Are we going to be switching the lanes? Are those things going to move forward as planned? And if you don't know, when would the board know what that would look like for all employees?
I would just add that I've heard that question more times than I would know how to track. And the answer has always been the same. And that is that I do believe it is the board's intent to honor whether it's steps or lanes. And that unfortunately, the world that we live in, it is not a guarantee. And so I do think that that is still the same answer that I would give someone on an elevator today as I would have given them 6 months ago. And sadly, the board is at the whim of what goes on with our legislature in Madison. And we run on a very interesting cycle. We have to present a budget that is enacted as of July 1st. And then the state doesn't adopt a budget until October. And so we have to guess. And it's usually a pretty good guess. But if people don't know that, then perhaps that's part of Dana's suggestion is how do you help others to understand that the reality is we're making a budget adoption that the board has to do. And then we have to circle back and wait until July or till October when we actually know what the state's going to do. And so it's not a fun process. It usually works out just fine, but just kind of wanted to let people know that that is part of the reality. So,
and just to further that too, I mean, this last school year was incredibly difficult for Ruth and for the board to try to budget because there were just so many variables. And we had extra expenses, obviously we didn't know about. We did have extra revenues, but we were going blind most of the year. So it's really challenging. And we still are somewhat in that same situation going forward into next year too.
Okay, well, again, I appreciate it. I know that a lot of time and energy goes into this. I also know it's not always a lot of fun to be talking about changes and things that have come back. And so again, thank you to all of you for spending this now, I think, rainy evening together. And please do stay tuned because I know that there will be more to come in the weeks ahead as we continue this dialogue. So again, with appreciation, have a good rest of your night and rest of your week.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.